In 1720, the pirate Bartholomew Roberts captured a vessel off the coast of West Africa. His crew did not want the cargo. They set the ship on fire with people still chained inside the hold. Within minutes, the water around the burning hull turned white with fins. Dozens of oceanic white-tipped sharks had arrived before the flames reached the mast. They had been following that ship for weeks, not because they sensed the fire, because they already knew what that ship was. For centuries, sailors on every ocean reported the same phenomenon. Sharks did not simply appear near vessels by coincidence. They followed them, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for an entire Atlantic crossing. Merchant sailor Edward Barlow noted in his diary in 1663 that sharks kept company with his ship across the coast of Portugal, swallowing everything thrown overboard. When the crew caught one and cut it open, they found sheep feet, a dead rat, and an entire ox hide that had been stripped from a carcass just hours earlier. A French priest named Jean-Baptiste Labat documented the same thing during his voyage to Martinique. A shark trailed his vessel for 3 days straight. Inside its stomach, the crew found every single object that had gone over the rail since the animal first appeared, including the carpenter's hammer. This was not random scavenging. This was learned behavior, refined across generations of predators that had discovered the most reliable food source in the open ocean: a wooden ship full of humans. And to understand why it worked so perfectly, you need to understand how a shark perceives the world. Because the ocean is not silent to them. It is a landscape of sound, chemistry, and electrical fields. And a ship lit up every single one of those channels at once. A shark does not need to see blood to find it. It detects dissolved amino acids in concentrations as low as 1 part per 10 billion. That is roughly equivalent to 10 drops of blood in a backyard swimming pool. Under optimal conditions, a strong current carrying the scent plume directly toward the animal, a shark can pick up a blood trail from roughly 1/4 of a mile away. That number is far smaller than the popular myth of smelling blood from miles off. But it did not matter. The shark did not need to detect a single drop from a great distance. It needed to detect a constant stream from a short one. And a ship provided exactly that. More importantly, sharks hear far better than they smell. Sound travels roughly 4 times faster in water than in air, and sharks can detect low-frequency vibrations between 10 and 800 hertz from distances that dwarf their olfactory range. The creak of a wooden hull under strain, the rhythmic thump of a bilge pump, the splash of waste hitting the surface, the irregular percussion of oars or a rudder. A ship was a broadcasting station of low-frequency noise, sending signals through the water continuously. Long before a shark could smell anything from a vessel, it could hear the vessel approaching. Once within a few hundred meters, the scent trail locked in the direction. Then there was one more sense. Sharks possess electroreceptive organs called ampullae of Lorenzini, small pores concentrated around the snout that detect the faint electrical fields generated by living organisms. Every beating heart, every flexing muscle produces a tiny bioelectric signature. In open water, this sense operates at close range, roughly a meter or less. But underneath a wooden hull, where dozens of men slept, worked, and moved directly above, those electrical signatures filtered through the planking. A shark hovering beneath a ship was surrounded by electrical evidence of life. The hull might as well have been transparent. A ship, then, was not invisible to a shark. It was the loudest, smelliest, most electrically active object in the open ocean. And from the perspective of a predator, it had one more critical quality. It produced food on a schedule. Start with the galley. Cooking on an 18th century ship happened in a metal box filled with sand, bolted near the bow. In rough weather, the fire had to be extinguished, and the crew ate raw salted beef, cold. When cooking was possible, the waste went straight over the side. Bones, fat, rotten meat, spoiled grain crawling with weevils. Ships carried live animals on board for fresh meat during long voyages: chickens, goats, sometimes cattle. The blood from slaughter, the offal, the hides, all of it went into the sea. There was no other option. There was no storage for waste. There was no disposal system. The ocean was the garbage pit. And the sharks learned the schedule. Morning waste after breakfast, evening waste after the main meal. The galley dump happened at roughly the same times each day, and predators that had followed ships for generations did not need to be taught when to expect the next feeding. Then there was the human waste. The toilet on most ships was nothing more than a plank with holes cut into it, mounted on platforms at the outside of the hull near the stern. The common name for this area was the head, because on many vessels it was located at the bow, near the figurehead. Crew members sat over open water. Everything dropped directly into the sea. Officers sometimes had chamber pots, but those were emptied overboard as well. The bilge, the lowest point inside the hull, collected rainwater, seawater from leaks, spilled food, urine, and whatever else drained downward through the decks. It was pumped out regularly, producing a foul slurry that poured from the ship's sides. A vessel left a continuous chemical trail behind it, visible as a change in water color for hundreds of meters in calm conditions. To any predator with chemoreceptive abilities, it was a highway. Now add disease. Scurvy alone killed more sailors than combat during the golden age of piracy. Scottish ship surgeon William Ferguson described scurvy patients who were unable to walk, emaciated and breathless, with rotting gums and swollen joints. John Woodall, the father of sea surgery, recommended citrus fruits as a treatment as early as 1617, but the advice was not widely adopted by the Navy until nearly 2 centuries later. In the meantime, scurvy continued to devastate crews on long voyages.
21,
Dysentery,
22,
typhus, malaria, and yellow fever added to the toll in tropical waters. A ship that left port with 80 men might have 60 by the time it crossed the Atlantic. The death rate for sailors during this period was roughly 730 per 100,000, according to later 19th century records. In earlier centuries, the number was almost certainly higher. The dead were sewn into their hammocks, weighted with cannonballs or iron shot, and dropped over the side. A brief reading from the scripture if there was a chaplain aboard, a volley of musket fire for officers, for common sailors, often nothing at all. Francis Rogers, a sailor from this period, described the burial of his ship's cook in blunt terms. Once the body was stitched into bedclothes, they heaved him overboard. Historian David Stewart noted that about half of the sailors who died at sea during this era were buried at sea, and half on land when the ship happened to be near port. Those buried at sea did not always reach the bottom undisturbed. Accounts from the era describe sharks consuming corpses before the bodies sank below the surface. Some floated behind the ship for hours because the weights were insufficient. The crew watched the fins close in. But disease was not the only reason bodies went into the water. Punishment was. The cat o' nine tails was the standard disciplinary tool on naval and pirate ships alike. It was a whip made of 9 knotted cords of tarred rope, each about 2 feet long, attached to a thick braided handle that weighed roughly 370 grams. A single blow was enough to break the skin. 3 dozen lashes was a common sentence. The punishment was always carried out on the open deck for 3 specific reasons. First, so the crew could witness it and be discouraged from similar offenses. Second, because the cramped lower decks did not have sufficient space to swing the whip at full extension. And third, because it was easier to wash the blood off the deck planks with seawater afterward. That blood, along with the wash water, ran through the scuppers and into the ocean. A flogging that drew blood was not a rare event. Drunkenness could earn 12 lashes on the authority of the captain alone. More serious offenses, theft, cowardice in battle, disobeying orders, brought far worse. Court-martial records from this period include sentences of 300 lashes and more, which were often fatal. On some ships, the ends of the whip's tails had small lead balls or fishhooks tied to them, turning a painful punishment into something closer to butchery. A man sentenced to a severe flogging could lose skin from his shoulders to his lower back. The boatswain's mate who delivered the blows stood 2 paces from the offender, swinging the cat over his head and stepping forward with each stroke for maximum force. In 1833, a deputy superintendent in Australia introduced a new version of the cat that he boasted could draw blood after only 4 lashes. The deck beneath the offender would be slick with blood by the end, and below the hull, the sharks had already gathered. Then there was keel hauling. This punishment, documented formally in the Dutch Navy as early as 1560, involved tying a rope to the offender and throwing him off the bow of the ship. A weight, usually a cannonball, was attached to his legs to pull him under the waterline. A second rope ran from the man's body under the keel to the opposite side. The crew dragged his body along the entire bottom of the ship and hauled him up on the other side. The hull of any vessel that had been at sea for more than a few weeks was encrusted with barnacles, razor-sharp shells cemented to the wood that shredded clothing, skin, and muscle on contact. The punishment was typically administered 3 times in succession. A man pulled through that underwater forest of blades emerged torn open from head to ankles, if he survived at all. Many drowned. Some had limbs torn away, and the blood pouring from a keel-hauled body drew sharks that were already lingering beneath the hull. Some accounts describe sharks attacking the victim during the passage under the keel, before the crew could haul him back aboard. Keel hauling was not originally intended as execution, but between drowning, blood loss, and the predators waiting below, it often was. A painting by Dutch artist Leva Peters, dated between 1660 and 1686, depicts the keel hauling of the ship surgeon of Admiral Jan van Ness. It hangs in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. The practice was not myth. It was policy. Welcome aboard. Every one of these systems, the galley waste, the human waste, the burials, the punishments, operated independently. But together, they created something no single event could: a permanent scent trail. A ship was not a momentary source of food. It was a moving buffet that never closed, and the species best adapted to exploit it was the oceanic white-tip shark. The oceanic white-tip, Carcharodonus longimanus, is a stocky, slow-moving predator that lives in the open ocean, far from any coastline or reef. Adults grow to 3 or 4 meters in length and weigh up to 170 kilograms. Their most distinctive feature is the broad, rounded, white-tipped dorsal fin that gives them their name, so large and paddle-shaped that no other open ocean shark can be confused with them. Before industrial fishing collapsed their populations in the late 20th century, oceanic white-tips were the most common large shark in tropical waters worldwide. Sailors before the 16th century did not even call them sharks. The word shark itself did not enter English until the 1565, likely from a Mayan or Caribbean language. Before that, sailors called all sharks sea dogs. and the oceanic whitetip earned that name more than any other species. The name came from their behavior. When an oceanic whitetip detects something that might be food, it approaches cautiously but stubbornly, circling and retreating, but never leaving. If driven off, it maintains a safe distance and waits. The moment an opportunity appears, it rushes in with a burst of speed that seems impossible for such a slow-moving animal. Persistent, patient, tireless, they never stop swimming. They breathe through ram ventilation, forcing water over their gills through constant forward motion. An oceanic whitetip cannot rest on the bottom the way a nurse shark or a carpet shark can. It must move or it dies. Which means an oceanic whitetip that started following a ship could stay with it for weeks without resting, because resting was never an option for that species in the first place. Their instinct to follow large moving objects is not a response to ships specifically. It evolved over millions of years of trailing schools of tuna, pods of dolphins, and migrating whales. Researchers have documented oceanic whitetips scavenging whale carcasses, following pilot whale pods, and shadowing tuna schools across hundreds of miles of open water. Any large object moving through the open ocean might mean food nearby. Ships simply became the largest and most consistent version of that signal. And unlike a pod of dolphins, a ship leaked blood, fat, and flesh every single day. But oceanic whitetips were not the only species involved. Bull sharks and tiger sharks appeared frequently in coastal waters near ports and along trade routes. Bull sharks are among the most aggressive predators in any ocean. They tolerate brackish water and can swim up rivers, one of the only shark species capable of this, which means they followed ships into harbors, estuaries, and river mouths where other shark species could not go. Tiger sharks, generalist feeders willing to eat almost anything organic, were drawn to the concentrated waste streams that ships left in shallower waters near land. Period accounts from West Africa specifically name bull sharks and tiger sharks as the species most commonly seen near anchored vessels. The combination of these three species meant that a ship was rarely without a predatory escort. Oceanic whitetips in the deep ocean, bull sharks in the coastal approaches, tiger sharks in the shallows. A vessel sailing from Europe to the Caribbean crossed through all three zones in sequence. The sharks changed species, but the escort never ended. Now here is the detail that turns a natural history fact into something far darker. The Atlantic slave trade created the most consistent and horrifying version of this system. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, an estimated 12.5 million enslaved people were transported across the Atlantic on ships specifically designed to carry human cargo. The conditions below deck were beyond description within the bounds of this account. People were chained in rows, packed so tightly they could not turn over, forced to lie in their own waste for weeks. Disease spread without resistance. Dysentery, smallpox, dehydration. The death rate on these crossings varied, but on many voyages, between 15 and 25% of the enslaved people died before reaching the other side. The bodies were thrown overboard, not individually and not rarely. Hundreds of thousands of them, across 3 centuries, along the same routes, following the same currents, season after season. One estimate places the total number of bodies disposed of at sea during the slave trade at over 1.8 million across 300 years. Dutch merchant William Bosman, writing about the West African coast in 1705, noted that when slave ships departed, sharks sometimes followed them for 3 weeks or a month. The animals grew visibly larger during the crossing, feeding on the dead thrown overboard along the way. Historian Marcus Rediker, drawing on testimony from ship captains, officers, and sailors, many of whom had no sympathy for abolitionism, concluded that sharks functioned as an integral part of the terror system aboard these vessels. Captains used the visible presence of sharks as a deliberate deterrent against resistance and escape. Jump overboard, and the sharks would be waiting. Everyone on board, enslaved and crew alike, could see them circling. The shark was not merely a scavenger in this system. It was an enforcer. The sharks were not simply attracted by individual events. They learned the routes. Generations of oceanic whitetips, bull sharks, and tiger sharks were conditioned by centuries of consistent feeding along specific Atlantic corridors. The triangular trade route, from Europe to West Africa, from West Africa to the Caribbean, from the Caribbean back to Europe, became a highway that predators patrolled the way wolves patrol a game trail. At the height of the trade, hundreds of ships per year crossed the same waters on the same schedules. The sharks did not need to find a ship. They waited on the route, and the ships came to them. Some researchers have noted that modern Atlantic shark migration patterns contain anomalies, routes that do not fully correspond to water temperature and current models alone. The suggestion, still debated and not proven conclusively, is that behavioral patterns imprinted over 400 years of the slave trade may still influence shark movement today. Hundreds of generations of predators taught to patrol specific corridors do not simply forget. One documented case makes this connection vivid. A ship called the Nancy was intercepted by a British patrol vessel enforcing anti-slave trade laws in the Atlantic. Before the patrol could board, the crew of the Nancy threw their illegal cargo documentation, the papers that proved they were carrying enslaved people, overboard in a weighted bag. A shark that had been following the ship swallowed the weighted papers. The British crew caught the shark and cut it open. They recovered the documents intact, enough to convict the captain in court. The shark had been trained by centuries of practice to swallow anything that left a ship. This time, what it swallowed was evidence. But the connection between ships and sharks was not limited to the slave trade. Every naval engagement, every boarding action, every battle at sea produced the same result. When a cannonball tore through a wooden hull at close range, the oak planking splintered into hundreds of jagged fragments that became secondary projectiles, shredding everyone in their path. The ship's surgeon worked below the waterline during combat, in a space called the cockpit, or the orlop, amputating crushed limbs with saws, knives, and tourniquets, cauterizing wounds with heated irons, packing stumps with tar or tallow. Amputation was the most common surgical procedure at sea, the fastest way to save a life when a limb was destroyed beyond repair. And the severed limbs, the blood-soaked rags, the tissue, all of it was carried up from the surgeon's station and thrown into the ocean. There was nowhere else to put it. A warship in the middle of a battle was not going to store medical waste. John Woodall, the first Surgeon General of the East India Company in the early 1600s, wrote a comprehensive manual for sea surgeons called The Surgeon's Mate. He described the tools, the procedures, the medicines, the proper contents of a surgeon's chest. He warned sea surgeons against earning the reputation of being butchers. What he did not need to describe, because every sailor already knew, was what happened to the biological waste. The sea took everything, and the sharks took it from the sea. After a major engagement, a ship might throw dozens of dead and dying men overboard within hours. The water around the vessel would be clouded with blood. Sharks arrived so quickly and in such numbers that sailors developed specific superstitions about them. Some crews believed that sharks could sense death before it happened, that a shark appearing near a ship meant someone aboard was about to die. This belief persisted for centuries and across every seafaring culture. The truth was simpler and worse. The sharks were already there. They had been there for days, following the sound and scent trail of the ship. The crew just had not noticed until the blood hit the water and the fins became visible at the surface. Consider what a calm day at sea meant for a crew, and for the sharks beneath them. No wind, no movement. The ship sat motionless on flat water, sometimes for days or weeks. Sailors called it being becalmed, and it was among the most feared situations at sea. Food and water ran low, tempers shortened, discipline cracked. For the sharks beneath the hull, a becalmed ship was something else entirely. The vessel could not outrun them. The waste continued to flow over the side on the same schedule. The scent trail was not diluted by forward movement. It pooled around the hull like a fog. Becalmed ships reported the highest concentrations of sharks, circling slowly in the flat water, bumping against the planking, their dorsal fins cutting lazy patterns around the motionless hull. Samuel Robinson, who sailed on a slave ship as a young man, wrote that the shark was rarely visible to the crew except in calm weather, when the ship moved slowly or sat still. He noted that there were few hours aboard any ship in which something was not thrown overboard: waste, offal, rubbish, scraps. The shark, Robinson wrote, positioned itself under the hull and waited. It did not need to chase, it only needed to stay. Now pull all of this together. A pirate ship of the Golden Age, roughly 1680 to 1725, was a vessel crewed by between 80 and 200 men. These men ate twice a day, producing food waste with every meal. They used open-air latrines that drained directly into the ocean. They slaughtered animals on deck for fresh provisions. They bled prisoners and punished their own crew with whips that opened skin to the bone. They fought naval battles and boarding actions that produced mass casualties and surgical waste. They buried their dead at sea. They sailed the same warm water routes, through the same currents, where sharks had been conditioned for generations to associate the sound and smell and shadow of a wooden ship with food. A pirate vessel was not haunted by sharks. It was built, by accident and by cruelty, to be the most efficient shark-feeding system the open ocean had ever seen. The shark was not a monster lurking in the deep. It was the most logical organism in the entire system. A predator that followed the evidence. A scavenger exploiting the most reliable food source available in an otherwise empty ocean. The ship trained the shark. The shark followed the ship. And the sailors, living and dying above that restless escort of fins, created the myth that the ocean itself was hunting them. It was not. They had simply taught it where to wait. The oceanic whitetip, once the most abundant large shark in tropical waters worldwide, is now classified as critically endangered. Its global population has declined by more than 90% since the mid-20th century. Regional assessments in the Atlantic and Indo-Pacific show collapses of the same magnitude. The primary cause is industrial longline fishing, which targets the oceanic whitetip's large, valuable fins for the international shark fin trade. The animal that once followed every sailing ship across every warm ocean is now encountered reliably in only a handful of locations. Parts of the Red Sea between June and November, Cat Island in the Bahamas between April and June, and a few isolated seamounts in the Pacific. The ships are gone. The waste streams are gone. The trade routes that sharks patrolled for centuries have been replaced by steel container vessels and diesel-powered freighters that produce almost no organic discharge. The oceanic whitetip lost its ancient food source, and then lost its population to the same species that once fed it. If you want to see what this channel covers next, subscribe now. There are more stories from the age of sail that have never been told this way. 400 years of human-made horror trained an entire species to follow us across the ocean. When we stopped feeding them, we started killing them instead. The oceanic whitetip followed ships because ships were the best thing that ever happened to it. Until they were the worst. Today, the animal that survived millions of years of evolution and outlasted the age of sail cannot survive us. The trail has gone cold, and the ocean